Chapter 4, The Revolutionary Era. Section 3, The Revolutionary War Begins. The British forces started with a severe advantage: better numbers, better finances. The question was, would Washington's leadership be able to prevail against this overwhelming odds? Of course, since this is a big history story, you already know it does, but that's not the point. Let's move on to the vocabulary. Redcoats: Molly Pitcher, Sybil Ludington, Deborah Sampson, James Middleton, Joseph Brant, Battle of Saratoga, Valley Forge, Inflation, Frederick von Steuben, and Marquis de Lafayette. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Britain was the odds-on favorite by a long shot. Bigger military, more money. The Redcoats, named for their red jackets for their uniforms, as British soldiers, were well trained, much more experienced. Britain even had German mercenaries working for them called Hessians. Meanwhile, the Continental Army under Washington only had about 19,000 people, no navy, no money, hardly any supplies. They could barely even pay the soldiers. When the war began, the role of women changed drastically as well. Originally, women had played a major part in boycotting. Now they did other tasks in order to help the troops. Some key examples are Mary Hayes, who became known as Molly Pitcher for her work bringing water to soldiers who were hot and tired in the battlefields. At the Battle of Monmouth, her husband was wounded and taken off of the field, and she took his place at the cannon until the end of the day. Washington noticed this and promoted her to sergeant, even though she wasn't officially a member of the army at all. Women also served as spies and scouts. 16-year-old Sybil Ludington made a 40-mile ride in the middle of the night in order to warn people of a British attack on Danbury, Connecticut. In the 4th Regiment of Massachusetts, there was a young soldier named Robert Shuttlesworth. This soldier was known for being a bit underage, but nobody asked questions, clean-shaven, kind of young. But he was a bit tough. After the battles with minor injuries, he'd go off and treat himself and not bother anybody with such minor issues. It wasn't until he came down with a fever and was examined in a hospital that people realized that he was a she. Robert Shuttlesworth was actually Deborah Sampson, a woman who had disguised herself as a man in order to be able to fight. Black colonists had their share of fighting as well, both on the British and colonial side. The British governor of Virginia even offered to free slaves who were willing to fight for Britain. On the continental side, they didn't originally want black soldiers, but the need for more soldiers outweighed the prejudice against the black citizens. Black soldiers received the same pay, the same goods, same supplies, but usually got worse jobs and less promotions. One notable exception was James Middleton, the only black officer. Native Americans played a role in the war as well. The Iroquois League had helped Britain in the French Indian War and now helped them against the colonists. Joseph Brant even went on to become a British officer, member of one of the native tribes, who brought with him the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondagas, and Cayugas to help. Further south, colonists also had issues fighting the Cherokee nations, who, while not allied with England, definitely were against the colonists. After being pushed out of Boston, General Howe relocated to New York, where he received reinforcements in the form of 300 ships and 30,000 soldiers. Before going back to war, Howe put word out to the colonists and asked for Washington's surrender, promising not to take any action against anybody who was willing to give up the fight. Washington, of course, refused. Howe's forces captured Long Island, but Washington was able to retreat under the cover of fog. In the Battle of Harlem Heights, the colonists scored some small victories, but again were forced to retreat to New Jersey and then further south into Pennsylvania. Due to the difficulties of keeping armies working in the cold and the snow, it was tradition in Europe in order to take a break during the winter and not fight battles again until spring. Washington, however, was not going to follow this tradition. Christmas night, 1776, Washington's men crossed the Delaware River and captured the town of Trenton, while most of the Hessian mercenaries were asleep. From there, Washington took Princeton before finally settling down in January for the rest of the winter. In the spring, Howe had planned to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, denying the ability for the colonists to get together and fight as a unit. Instead, he changed at the last moment and attacked Philadelphia first. Howe's army faced Washington again, and again Washington was forced to retreat, but with light casualties. Meanwhile, British General John Burgoyne took part of his force down the Hudson River while the rest headed up the St. Lawrence, splitting his regiment based on the concept that he was expecting reinforcements from Howe that he did not realize were not coming. Burgoyne was able to take back Ticonderoga easily, but it was not going to last. In reaction to the loss of Ticonderoga, Congress had sent General Horatio Gates for the Continental Army. Without Howe's support, Burgoyne began to run low on supplies. By October, he found himself with only 5,000 men at Saratoga facing General Gates and his 17,000 colonial men. Granny Gates, as his soldiers used to call him, surrounded the British for days without moving in. It wasn't until a charge led by Benedict Arnold that turned the tide were they able to capture the fort of Saratoga. In exchange, Benedict Arnold was shot in the leg again and accused of disobeying orders. Washington's troops spent the following winter at Valley Forge. This is considered one of the lowest points in the war for the colonists. 12,000 soldiers spent cold winter in tents with low amount of food and snow all about them. It was respect for Washington that held the army together in the hard times. The strict discipline he kept was also counterbalanced by his constant pleading to Congress for better conditions for his soldiers. The war was also very expensive. Ammunition, food, soldiers' pay, costs were adding up quick. With little in the way of gold and silver to back up the money they were printing, inflation was running rampant. The value of the money was going lower and lower and the prices of goods going higher and higher. Many farmers, even with colonial loyalties, were selling to the British simply because they could make money that was worth something that way. It wasn't until Arnold's victory at Saratoga that other countries took an interest and were willing to openly help the colonies. Prussian commander Baron Frederick von Steuben originally joined Washington at Valley Forge and trained soldiers. Today's military drill and ceremony books come from this man. The French Marquis de Lafayette also joined the war effort, and very soon became Washington's second in command.